welcome to the final section of the first ICA weekend. Once again, before I continue, I'd request all of you to file in and just sit down so that we can begin with the keynote address. We have with us someone who probably embodies the many different things that ICA represents. In many ways, if you put together all the themes and all the narratives and experiences that the ICA weekend represents, and there's a human form of that, we have him with us today. Professor Krishnendu Ray is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. He was a chair of the department from 2012 to 2021. He's the author of the Migrants table, which was published in 2004, and the Ethnic Restaurateur, which was published in 2016, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia, which was published in 2012. He was formerly a faculty member and the acting associate dean of liberal arts at the Culinary Institute of America between 1996 to 2005, and the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society from 2014 to 2018. Professor Ray is an editorial collective member of the food studies journal, Gastronomica, a board member at the Southern Foodways Alliance, and one of the chairs of the James Beard Foundation Journalism Awards Committee. So as you can see, this is probably the perfect profile for a keynote speaker and more. We couldn't have been more fortunate to have Professor Ray with us to deliver the final address of this weekend and rightly close off the very insightful and rich discussions that we've had in the last 2 days. With his expertise and interests in food studies, immigration, ethnicity, and cultural sociology that he brings into his commentary, as I said before, I think Professor Ray really embodies in the human form everything that we have discussed in the last 2 days and everything that we have had the pleasure of listening to from our eminent speakers. Without wasting more time and without much ado, Professor Ray, over to you. I think Professor Ray has a presentation to share, so if you want, you could share your screen right now.
Okay. Hey, thanks a lot, Anshuman. Thanks a lot, Tanushri. I'm speaking to you from, in fact, Louisiana, and I'm headed to a hiking trip and a camping trip to see the eclipse. I'm sorry that I've missed the event in person. I hope to be there next time. So I'm going to start with my talk right away. Let's see, this one. Anshuman, you were going to tell me, stop me if the slide is not moving and you cannot see or hear me, right?
Sure, right now we can see and hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so I'm going to set my time so that I know I don't take too much time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, the title of my talk is Soft Power is Not So Easy to Accumulate. I know that's going to disappoint some of you or dishearten, but I'll give you some evidence as to why I say so. I'm going to make about half a dozen points today. And maybe it is, in fact, a lot more fun to do Q&A. We don't have too much time for Q&A today. We'll have a little bit of time at the end, maybe 10 minutes. And Anshuman, feel free to share this PowerPoint with any of the audience members if they ask for it. And so, let's see. Okay, just in time for your event today, I would say the New York Times today has a list of 100 best restaurants in New York City. And I'm going to talk to you from New York City, about New York City as one of the global cities, which is part of this whole question of soft power. This just came out today, and number one is Tatiana by Kwame Onuachi. Predictably, and this became important, in fact, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a relationship between social movements and acclaim in the cultural realm. Amongst a number of Indian restaurants that are there, in a list of 100, there are about three, and two of them, one of them is Sema here by Unapologetic Foods, who have become quite visible. And surprisingly, Hyderabadi Zaika at number 95 out of 100. In fact, it's more interestingly also a takeout place. And I ordered biryani from there, and it was good enough or good. And so this discussion about cultural power is in the context of, I'm going to give you the wider context. There are about 800,000 eating and drinking establishments in the United States. Many have bounced back from COVID-19, which was quite a catastrophe. And that happened with a series of very powerful interventions by the federal government. And a lot of money was poured into especially sustaining employment. To give a comparative sense, among a little less than 1 million, as I said, eating and drinking establishments, 24,000 in New York City. I'm going to focus on New York City as an important global city in discussing questions of hard power and soft power. There are about 140,000 single location full service restaurants. These are the restaurants we talk about when New York Times lists, but in this New York Times listing, there are even a couple of street vendors, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about them later. And these are also the restaurants that are evaluated by Michelin. I will share data with you from Zagat's, Michelin, and of course, New York Times too. There are about 500,000 independent restaurateurs and about 7,000 fine dining restaurants. I'm going to move this so I can see it. Just to give you kind of the landscape, most restaurants that self-identify with an ethnicity or nationality, the most popular are Italian-American restaurants in the United States and specifically in New York City. There are about 2,000 Italian restaurants in New York City. They're distributed by about 70% of them are pizzerias and 30% are restaurants. And take a note of the population, which is about 16 million people in the United States identify with Italian-American identity. That number is going to be interesting and important to keep in view, which is about 600,000 in New York City. The other very popular cuisine, probably globally, but surely in the United States and specifically in New York City, is Chinese American restaurants. There are about 50,000 Chinese American restaurants in the United States, about 2,500 in New York City. And look at the number of people, about 5.5 million people in the United States. This is, in fact, one of the interesting domains of change in terms of cultural capital and visibility, that Chinese American restaurants were mostly and still are mostly relatively cheap takeout places. Some of them, about 2 to 3%, have been moving up in the upscale domain. And in fact, most of the interesting Chinese restaurants are in the mid-market range right now. And these basically tops off the top three in most American cities with some variation. I have data from about a dozen American cities. The third one is Mexican American. This is an approximation, 50,000 restaurants, just like Chinese American, half of about Italian American, and under 1,000 in New York City. But look at the population, 35 million people claim Mexican American heritage. And though the numbers in New York City are relatively lower than in, say, the West Coast, in Texas, this is going to be the domain of the most dramatic change in American and global American food over the next 2 decades. That is because of that number, 35 million compared to 5 million Chinese American, compared to 16 million Italian American. To give a comparable sense, that is about 35 to 45 million people also claim heritage, English heritage, and German heritage. The two biggest numbers, along with Irish heritage, that dominates American politics and popular culture. And because we are interested, because of ICA, and because we are interested in this question of Indian American restaurants and soft power, etc., there are nationally about probably 4,000 restaurants, about 300 in New York City, counted in different ways. The New York City itself has to license, so we have a kind of a harder number in New York City, and the population you see is like the Chinese American population, 5 million in the nation. It has some demographic difference. And for instance, the Indian population tends to be with the highest number in terms of college degrees. So that's about 70%. And in fact, which is a disincentive because Indians have many more Indian immigrants in the United States have college degrees and are Anglophone, people like me. Hence, our credentials are transferable. Hence, many of us, in fact, do not get into the restaurant business because it is a very difficult and a tight business with very tight margins. So I'm going to look at popularity and prestige data, and I'm going to compare a couple of cities to give you a sketch of the world. This is Zagat's. Zagat's is started evaluating restaurant from the 1977 onwards. They published this for the first time in 1979. They collected enough data to make it a representative sample in some ways of New York City. The first public available data on price is from 1986. Unfortunately, they stopped collecting price data from 2016, and when Google bought it, partly because it's trying to compete in a new domain, where in fact that kind of a detailed price data for a meal for one person with a glass of wine and taxes and tips is not of particularly useful data for the consumer. But for the analyst like me, it's kind of a loss. What I do want to show that this is over the 30 years, 1986 to 2016, which was probably the period of some of the greatest transformation in what I call the hierarchy of taste of the American public. And you can see a couple of things if you just look on the right side, the 2016 data. Number one there is Japanese. And Japanese had been high since the 1980s and moving higher. The most expensive restaurants in New York City today are omakase menu Japanese restaurants, and that's true in many parts of the world. My friends and colleagues who have analyzed Shanghai show a similar pattern. Some of the most expensive restaurants in Shanghai now are Japanese restaurants, and then much more predictably French, which has a long history, and I'm going to talk about that today. The French have dominated Western haute cuisine culinarity since about the 18th century, end of the 18th century, and through the 19th century. And often it has expressed itself not only in France, but in places like London and in places like New York City. And they still play an important role. After that, you have American, and especially if you call it New American, that's the high-end part of how the ranking changes, climbs up from, say, 6 in 1986 to a number 3 in 2016. This, by the way, is the average price of a meal with, as I was saying, with a glass of wine, taxes, and tips for one person. I'm ranking that, and I'm using price here as a surrogate for prestige. And then you see Continental on that list. Continental is a dying category. Very few restaurants in New York City classify themselves as Continental. It used to be what Americans thought about and classified high-end, expensive European hotel food. It has now, an ersatz version of it has come to be seen as the so-called continental breakfast, which is tea, coffee, baked goods, etc., yogurt, etc. It's probably going to vanish as a useful category over the next few cycles of evaluation. Then you see Italian, Spanish, Greek, Korean. Italian has been climbing very dramatically from the 1970s. This graph shows in some ways an opposite movement from here, number 2 to number 5. That is because many more Italian pizzerias have come into play, so that brings down the average price. But I'm going to show you other data, Yelp data and Michelin data, that will show that Italian, in fact, is performing quite highly as a prestige cuisine in New York City. And that is the last 40 years, last 50 years. And I'm going to link it to demographic change and a pattern of the end of the migration of poor Italians into the United States. Then you have Spanish, Greek, Korean. And the fastest moving in my data set on that one was Greek and Korean moving up. In fact, that was already predicting what we had not yet seen in terms of individual Korean restaurants. And today, in fact, Korean is the fastest moving category, upward mobile category, along with Japanese, French, and Korean and Vietnamese had been moving up. Then you see Mexican, then you see Indian. This ranking, excuse me, this ranking about 10 to 12 in terms of prestige and in terms of price is in fact quite a stable position that Indian cuisine occupies in this hierarchy of taste. This is Yelp data from more than 250 hits on Yelp in descending order of popularity. On the y-axis, you see there your top 3, Italian, Chinese, Mexican, then particularly New York City, with the strength of African-American population and especially the idiom of soul food specifically. And then you see Seoul, you see Japanese, New American, Southern, Spanish, Thai, Korean, and then Indian. That's about, again, in that range of 10 to 12 cuisines in New York City that plays an important role. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is the data in green, which is the price data at the higher end of it. Yelp distributes its price into 4 categories, which is inexpensive, moderate, pricey, and very pricey. I collapse the very pricey and the pricey data to clean up the data for its visual representation here. You can see a couple of things in terms of very pricey, the data in green. You see the French restaurant down there, 27% of French restaurants in New York City are high-end restaurants, expensive restaurants. So in spite of all the talk of decline of French, etc., it in fact retains its position quite substantially well at the high end of the marketplace. After that, you will see New American, which is about 24%, Italian at the top at 12%, Chinese, as I was saying, in this data, only 2% of Chinese restaurants out of 2,500 restaurants in New York City are high-end restaurants. Mexicans 6%, which in fact has been doing very well. And then you have Seoul. And if you look at Indian there, that is 3%. Okay, 3% of, let's round out Indian restaurants in New York City, which is 300, you end up with basically about 9%, kind of 9 restaurants, which are high-end Indian restaurants, which is often what we hear about in terms of talk. I have done this kind of analysis for about 20 cities of the world, and I'll compare it with the inevitable comparison, which is London in terms of hierarchy of taste. London, predictably, you see popularity of Indian food. On the y-axis, it's Indian, Italian, American, Chinese, etc., Vietnamese, Korean down there. Indian food, of course, as we know, is very popular in London, much more popular than in New York City. And in fact, I would say maybe this is the first analogy, first lesson. Indian food is to London what Italian food is to New York City in terms of its performance, popularity. But if you look at prestige, again, that green data, prestige, if price is a surrogate for prestige, we do not have any direct measures of prestige. I'm using price as a surrogate for prestige. You will see, look at the French, almost 50% of French restaurants in London are high-end. 22% of Japanese restaurants are high-end. 19% of Italian, 23% of Spanish restaurants, and 12% of Indian restaurants are high-end. If you rank them, again, Indian food in terms of popularity, it ranks very high in London, but in terms of price as a surrogate for prestige, again falls in the category of about 10th to 12th in a global city marketplace, which is, of course, not in India, but elsewhere. So my view is from elsewhere. In places like Singapore, in places like Bangkok, it does slightly differently. And in places like Shanghai, it does even more poorly. And in some of the urban centers of sub-Saharan Africa, it does also differently. This is Michelin coverage of New York City restaurants. I've been following it very closely since Michelin came into town in 2005, 2006. To give you a sense, remember I said there are 24,000 restaurants in New York City, and out of which Michelin covers about 500, only at the higher end of it. The most coverage it gives is to what is called what it calls American and Contemporary. These are, by the way, self-classifications. All these are self-classifications. In fact, we are not here talking about how authentic these foods are by some measure. This is what the people who own and run these restaurants self-classify. So it's American Contemporary, Italian Regional, Japanese are the top 3 in Michelin, French number 4, Chinese Regional number 5, which is getting regionalized right now in New York City. And by the way, that's a symptom of upward mobility of a cuisine when it begins to regionalize in an ethic view, from the view of the outsider. Of course, insiders always know that things are regional, but when the outsiders get to know that things are regional, you begin to see it's a symptom of upward mobility. Again, it goes through Mexican, Korean, Mediterranean, Indian there, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 10th there in terms of coverage, petering out at the end. This is Michelin, how it has changed from 2006 to 2023, the latest data I have looked at. The widest coverage is of American Contemporary, then Italian Regional. The numbers are going down for Italian Regional if you look at it. So in some ways, it is prefiguring a change in the marketplace. Since these are percentages, that means others are moving up into some of those places. Japanese, in fact, is moving up even at the highest of the high end that Michelin focuses in. You can see that number moving up from 9% to 12%. French, surprisingly for Michelin, going down from 9 to 6%. Chinese has tripled from 3 to 6% of Chinese restaurants. Restaurants covered in Michelin in New York City now are Chinese, 6%. Chinese has doubled from 3 to 6. Mexican has tripled from 2% to 6%. Korean has quadrupled from 1% to 4%. This is rate of change. And Indian is down there, but it does a consistent about 2%, maybe 3%, like we saw with the New York Times list too. Directly about soft power, the Korean government has been pouring money into what they call moving the ranks in terms of Hansik cuisine to make it amongst the top 5 cuisines globally, whatever that means, the metrics of that. In the United States, in the popular market, they have intervened in putting money into the Kimchi Chronicles on PBS, the public channel. And the Korean president has taken personal initiative in moving the needle on that. Maybe this is my another major argument. I find that soft power, in fact, follows hard power. And I'll give you a couple of examples in the last 10 minutes of my talk here. Very clearly in Western high-end restaurants. The restaurant, the word itself is a French word from restoration, born in the 18th century, becomes dominant in the 19th century. And the French provide an alternative to the English mass production. As the English and Americans dominate mass production, they are in some ways the Chinese of the 18th and the 19th century, while the French, in fact, dominate in the subcategories of couture, perfumes, cuisine, literature, etc. A lot more cultural capital than capital. But the French have high per capita income at this point of time, high employment, and low underemployment. And we will see how that is related, in fact, to the lack of the emigration, moving of poor people from France elsewhere in the world, which stops much earlier on, which in some ways is linked to soft power. And I'll make that argument obvious down the road here. The second thing is this cultural capital gets a second wind through post-war US occupation. And you will see a through line in all this is all the powers that do well in terms of cultural capital in the post-war era have all been either US allies or have been occupied by the United States. Italy was the same. Upscaling of Italian restaurants in New York, in the US, came about 30 years later, which was strongly linked to the end of poor Italian migration at the end of even in the interwar period, surely in the post-war period. Prestige of Italian food in the US has climbed since the 1970s. This was the second wave. The first wave was long before that, which was from the early Republic. Thomas Jefferson, famous for taking Mexican idioms and making something very American out of it, which is mac and cheese, which is often written in the early menus in French, associating a certain kind of a prestige and power with language and identity. Japan and Korea have, as I said, have become the most visible culinary powers at the high end of the cuisine, not necessarily popularity. Prestige of Japanese cultural idioms like japonoseri, very visible in the West since the 1850s. And if you have ever seen an Impressionist painting, you will see the influence of Japanese use of light and that kind of shimmering bright quality where Western French and Western artists were mimicking often Japanese silk, ink on silk, ink on paper. Also very clearly, my other point, end of immigration by the poor and the ostracized. There was a gentleman's agreement in 1907 between the United States and Japan that stopped Japanese migration into the United States. Japanese, in fact, ended up, just like Indians, in fact, some of the highest per capita income in the United States, higher than even whites. Furthermore, unusual in the Japanese case, strongly associated with empire. And it's, for instance, when the Japanese talk about curry rice, they are not thinking curry raisu, they are not thinking about Indian food. It comes through the British Navy. It's a social Darwinist presumption about eating, in this particular case, often associated with beef, vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions, that they see as strengthening their naval power and their biopolitics. It's very clearly, it goes to, curry goes to Japan through, in fact, the British Navy. What is interesting is wherever there is the military, in fact, journalists follow and write about the place, and about a generation later, tourists follow. And I call that the military tourist journalistic kind of a paradigm about it. Very similar with South Korea in terms of the Korean War. Koreans fighting for Americans in Vietnam as allies. Korean adoptees. New York Times often carries whole pages of the New York Times about Korean adoptee and Korean adoptee food. And there are no poor Korean immigrants coming into the United States. Similar analogy with the US military sent thousands of young men to Bangkok for R&R in the course of the Vietnam War, and lot of the familiarity and the prestige of Thai food in the United States comes out of, in fact, the Vietnamese conflict, and then a migration of Thai, and then the use of power by the Thai government to promote certain kinds of exports. So the larger pattern, what I'm pointing to you, is the rise of the U.S. outer empire. And the relationship here is between war, journalism, tourism. And the specificity of the popularity and the prestige of Korean food, which is very recent, just last 7 years in the United States. And I was already seeing it in my data on, sorry, I'm just going to check my time. Okay, a couple of minutes left. On Zagat's data, it's showing up in, of course, Yelp data and Michelin data. It acquired partly prestige in Japan through various kinds of things like Asian Games, like Olympics, like World Cup soccer that it shared, and of course, TV shows. That has become a very important part of soft power, also true about Indian soft power in those domains. But the difference is that presence of US military and that direct contact. So what I'm pointing to, my argument I'm making here, I'm writing a long 30,000 word piece and for my next book, but you will also see something come out of the Indian International Center Journal on Food, which elaborates on this argument, is the entanglement of hard power and soft power, and its relationship of acquisition of soft power to the end of poor immigration and high domestic employment. In the last 2 minutes, I'm going to finish with this argument, which is I see the rise of Chinese food in terms of prestige, largely in the mid-market. When my book, the Ethnic Restaurateur, came out, the Atlantic's Joe Pinsker did a long piece where he summarized my argument by saying future is expensive Chinese food. And there are certain counterpoints to it. If you get a chance, take a look at that Atlantic piece. Out of China, there's still out-migration of poor people that is slowing down, and the demographic change is going to lead to even a bigger slowdown, which in fact is going to aid in Chinese culinary soft power. Right now, it is mostly climbing into the mid-market and largely feeding students and professionals. There are about 1 million international students in the United States. The two biggest sources are China and India. NYU, my university, has the largest number of international students in the United States. Again, Chinese and Indians, and a lot of the hotpot places around NYU are becoming visible, largely feeding the Chinese students and professionals, different from what the Chinese takeout has for about 100 years, fed mostly outsiders. And let's link with the chop suey craze. What is the sushi craze now was the chop suey craze in the 1920s. And now I'm going to close off my argument here by saying Indian culture in terms of soft power. This is the 21st century and a counterweight to Chinese mass production, very much. India could be positioned as a counterweight to, just like the French were to the British. And many more survival of many more crafts, saris, textiles, jewelry, because partly mass production, either in the American model or in the communist model, often destroys handicrafts in both domains. India has avoided that, and hence there's a big resource in there. And we have, of course, seen Indian music, Indian art, and especially novels in English and IT as a kind of soft power playing a role. Of course, the Indian advantage there is Anglophonity. In fact, my argument in the long piece I'm writing is it is not so much that Indian food is going to become a lot more high-end and visible in New York City, but in fact, Indian food writing in English. That's where the future is. And that's is exploding. And I specify in the article who are the many writers, new writers of Indian heritage coming up, and in fact replacing many of the Jewish writers that used to be dominant in the American public sphere. Of course, social media accessibility, Indian food always does much better on Instagram than, of course, on TikTok. TikTok is banned in India. TikTok might get banned in the United States. Of course, Chinese food does much better on TikTok. Another last comment in there is different cities play a different role in it. Indian food does better in Bangkok and Singapore, Dubai. That will probably play a different role along with London, along with, of course, Indian cities. So nevertheless, there are certain limits of soft power. India still has a relatively low per capita GDP. No country has acquired soft power without ending out migration. And I mean, the solution is employment at home. India has not been able to produce the jobs it needs to produce at home to keep people at home. And this is the heart of what I call the hierarchy of taste. The food of poor people, immigrants, anywhere in any global city is never evaluated highly. So that's one of the burdens of soft power. India has, for the size of the country, number of people, relatively low levels of tourism. And of course, France, Paris is number one in the world. The Spanish cities are doing very well. To give you a sense, 100 million people visit, and that also happens with New York City. About 65 million people visit, and related to that is weak passport power. And that's related to being a labor sending country, have a very lower rank in visa-free travel. And that's the difference between culinary power and, say, IT power or power in terms of English novels, if you're thinking, right? For to be there, it is still necessary to eat the food to evaluate it, while you can read a novel or listen to music remotely and digitally. You do not need to travel there. So that's a major difference between culinary soft power and other forms of soft power that is unlikely to change in the next 20 years. So as I said, closing, India ranks amongst global cities about 10 to 12 with different kinds of data. In data sets, you will see its ranking like that. I have data on other European cities, Canadian cities, Berlin, Frankfurt, Vancouver, Toronto, that I have not used today. Of course, it does differently in Bangkok, Singapore. Shanghai does much more weakly. Tokyo, it still doesn't do that well. Taipei, these are going to be important cities. And of course, paradoxically, this is the price one pays under American hegemony, which is changing, not occupied by the US. Japan, Korea have this peculiar paradoxical advantage in terms of visibility. Madhur Jaffrey once quipped to me, Americans seem to love the food of the people they have gone to war with. And that's, in fact, not that difficult to explain if conflict is seen as a form of contact. And in this case, of course, the presence of the military, and with it journalists, with it a generation later tourism, then brides, and then adoptee, which is part of this kind of why I say not that easy to accumulate cultural capital, specifically in the domain of culinarity. And of course, this is an analysis of about a dozen global cities, some new, some old. The good news is New York City is not going to be that important in the 21st century as it was in the second half of the 20th century, but other cities like Shanghai are going to be much more important. And in fact, Indian food does relatively poorly in Shanghai and in Taipei, which are the emerging centers with the center of accumulation of capital. So let me stop there. Thank you for having me today. And after this event, I'm going to go out, hike, and position myself to watch the eclipse tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ray, for that extraordinarily rich presentation, which was so data intensive. And as someone who someone who works on geopolitics and foreign policy, I really liked how you masterfully, sort of contextualize your food scholarship in soft power and geopolitics. Thank you for that. We are short on time, so we won't be able to take more than 2 questions. The floor is open for questions. Not more than 2
Anshuman,
questions.
you're going to translate me the questions. Yeah.
I think you'd be able to hear the questions.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
People are digesting the data.
Yeah, I think the audience is taking time to process and digest the data, the graphs that you showed.
That's good. In fact, share it with them, and people can
Yes,
write
absolutely.
to me with my email. It's very easily visible. It's krishnendu.ray@nyu.edu. You can reach out for the slideshow, and you will see more of this work in the India International Center Journal coming out over the next few months, and then, of course, a much longer version of this in the next year or 2. I'm kind of my work tends to be very data heavy, and I'm very careful and cautious to make arguments. I need a lot of data. I almost depend on too much data. And so reach out to me and I'll send it to you.
Sure. Makes perfect sense. If any one of you have any questions, you can reach out to Professor Ray at krishnendu.ray@nyu.edu. In case you forget that email, just drop us your questions into our email, indianculinaryagenda@gmail.com, and we'll make sure that they are forwarded to Professor Ray and his answers are forwarded back to you. Once again, I think, we were just, Tanushree and I were just discussing something you just said really stood out to me, which is that Americans love the food of the countries they go to war against. And as I said, someone who works on armed conflict and foreign policy, that's probably something you've provoked me to look more into that now, encourage my colleagues to also look into the intersections of food and foreign policy. Once again, Professor Ray, thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule. Thank you for joining us at such an ungodly hour from yours, I think about 5:30 a.m. Wee hours in the morning. Also, I would like to thank you, if I have not mentioned before, but I mentioned it yesterday, which is thank you for joining our final jury and reading. You read, 7 papers in total of almost 5,000 words each in about 4 days, I think. An unthinkable task for many of us. So thank you so much for doing that too, with great patience and commitment. We wish you a lovely hike in Louisiana, and I hope you enjoy your eclipse, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, Anshuman.
Thank you.